Now, as I mentioned to you earlier in the course, just because something is the way it is doesn't mean everything is right about it or that it should be that way. And the same is true for the federalist nature of our country. There are various pros and cons that have been discussed at length, and I'm only going to go over a handful of them in this course. Now, two of the primary pros that are often argued to federalism's favor is that the state and local governments provide a candidate training ground. The idea being that if we require people to run for office and to be office holders at the national level, it makes sense that they would be able to gain experience at the local and state level, whether it be as a mayor, governor, senator, what have you. State and local governments also serve as laboratories of democracy. And what is meant by that is, if there is a national issue or a national problem, and it's unclear which policy solution would be the best to deal with that problem, different states can try different solutions to that problem. That way, if something goes wrong, well, at least it only went wrong in that particular state, and the rest of the country now knows better. Some cons are that both of these pros have some flip sides. Cons include the fact that because you have different sovereign states that can make laws within their own boundaries, it can result in a patchwork of laws and regulations. And if we're dealing with a nationwide problem, that can sometimes impede the national response, sometimes to deleterious effects. State government can also have varied implementation of national laws. So the national government can pass a law but leave administrative implementation to the states, but some states might implement the law and enforce the law more differently than others. And we're going to talk more about each of these pros and cons more in depth. So a pro, you need experience to run for national office. And experience, believe it or not, has been historically valued by American voters whenever choosing national leaders. So much, in fact, that out of 45 presidents, only 3 did not have any experience previously before becoming elected president. Ulysses S. Grant, primary experience in the military. Dwight D. Eisenhower, also most of his previous, or all of his previous experience was in the military. And then the current president, Donald Trump, whose previous experience was in real estate, business, and entertainment. Next is this idea of laboratories of democracy, and I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into this. Now, the phrase laboratories of democracy comes from an opinion by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was actually writing in a case over what you would think would be a rather trivial matter. It was whether or not a state could require somebody to have a license in order to sell ice. After all, you needed a license to sell certain types of food, certain types of beverages, and they considered ice to be a food. The person sued, an ice seller sued, in order to be exempt from this requirement. And Brandeis suggested that it wasn't the court's place to say that a state can't require a license, even if it does seem trivial. And that's because states served as, quote, laboratories of democracy, where there could be a variety of policies, and we could sit back and observe how things turned out. Now that is logic that has lasted until this day. I mentioned to you earlier that where you live can determine the kind of rights and privileges you have. Consider drug policies. There was a long-standing debate in this country as to whether or not marijuana should be legal. There is a national ban on the substance, but there were many arguments that came to the forefront as to whether or not such a ban was wise. And consequently, a lot of states have legalized it. It was very controversial, but an argument in favor of legalization at the state level was that if the effects to public health or public morality were negative, then this isn't something that we brought upon the entire country. It was only California, or it was only Colorado, and what have you. And so in this way, if the policy is a success, then it's a model that other states can adopt. If it is a failure, then it's something that other states know to avoid. Now let's revisit this slide, which I showed you earlier. And I'm going to point out that last bullet point here. The rights and liberties you have can depend on where you live. Recall this map I just showed you. Yes, from a policy perspective, whether or not marijuana and the legalization of it has bad or good effects is something that can be tested by using this piecemeal state-by-state approach. But let's say you live in California and you, as a responsible citizen stimulating your local state economy, do partake in buying marijuana at your local dispensaries. You then get in your car and take a road trip to Idaho. Well, as soon as you step out of your car, you are no longer a desirable consumer and good, upstanding citizen who is stimulating your local economy. You're now a criminal and could be prosecuted as such because you are in possession of a banned substance. This is something that is quite problematic, considering that something that is considered good behavior in one state could land someone in jail in another state. And it is argued that this violates this whole notion of equal treatment under the law and due process of law. Recall I'll mention in a later lecture the Aristotelian idea of treating like cases alike. And the whole notion behind equal rights and civil liberties and civil rights in this country is that you treat equal situations in equal ways. And this is an example of when like situations are treated unequally, simply because of where the person lives. Now, another example is same-sex marriage. It's legal nationwide now, but look at how the landscape looked in 2013. In red are states where it was completely banned, and the blue states are where it was completely legal. Where you lived could determine whether or not you had the ability to enter into a contract that most of the population had the right to enter into. The historical implications of state actions also have the effect on the relationship between the national government and states to this day. Because of their history of discrimination and segregation and the attempts to block voters of color from voting at the polls, the states in red actually fall under something called pre-clearance. This is where the Justice Department has to clear any and all changes that these states make to their election laws because of their past histories of voter discrimination. Now, because of a recent Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder, the Justice Department's ability to do this has been considerably limited. We'll talk about that a little later in the discussion. But this is just to tell you that historically, the rights that you enjoyed sometimes were conditioned on not only the state you lived in, but your race, unfortunately. And if you bring that to the modern day, again, as I told you, we're seeing federalism playing out right before us. Now, this was what the state of the national response to the coronavirus pandemic looked like in late March. The ones in the dark solid color were states that had statewide stay-at-home orders. The other states either had partial or no stay-at-home orders whatsoever. And this was a piecemeal response that was unlike anything that was being observed in other countries. But for all the reasons that I've just discussed, federalist nature of our country, this is why the coronavirus pandemic has been so piecemeal and why there has been arguably a sort of lack of a national response. It's because our system doesn't really lend itself to one. Now, sure, there are individual decisions that policymakers have made that are certainly fair game for criticism, but it isn't unlike the way things have been done before. You can argue that the coronavirus pandemic, being something that we haven't tackled before, warranted a new kind of response. I'm not here to make that judgment. I'm just here to explain this is why it's played out the way it has. So, what does this mean for you? Well, largely, I want you to take away that federalism and the way it works currently is a product of our history. It determines the form of policy response that we make to national problems, national issues, national emergencies, and the debate affects you. As I've kept on returning to over and over again, the rights and privileges you enjoy, the laws you have to follow, are primarily a product of state and local laws, state and local regulations. And going forward, I want you to think about the following questions. How does federalism impact your communities? What does it mean about your opportunities for participation? After all, many would argue that one of the pros of a federalist system is that politics and governance is not just happening 1,200 miles away, at least from where I am, in Washington, D.C. It's happening down the street, it's happening down the highway, or it's happening in your state capital, at your city council building, at your city council meetings, at your school board meetings, and there's very little getting in your way uh, if you want to go to those meetings or to participate in your local governance and make your voice heard. It also means that you have a lot more access to politicians than you probably think. Sure, you're probably not going to get a sit down with the president, but you might be able to sit down and speak with a city councilman or a state legislator. These are very accessible people, and not a lot of people realize that that is very much an option to make your voice heard if you have issues in your community that you care about. And so that concludes this short series of lecture videos on federalism. And if you have any questions, please feel to contact me.